During World War II, there were more than 18,000 B-24 Liberator and 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers produced by the U.S. war industry. Today, there are only a handful of B-17s and one B-24 that can fly. When the Collins Foundation B-17 and B-24 visit the Rogue Valley International Airport, men who served in such planes when they were young come to remember and reminisce about the time when they became men of the air.
I went into the Air Force, I was inducted, and my wish or goal then was to be a mechanic. But in basic training, I got through with basic training, they said they didn't need any mechanics. They had too many of them as it was, and that since I qualified sharpshooter on the rifle range, I would be a gunner.
When I got to gunnery school, I had no choice. I was just assigned to the rear turret. And I think one of the reasons that I was is because I was pretty small, about 5'7" and weighed about 130 pounds, and so they knew I would fit into that little turret.
I volunteered, and as a matter of fact, when I got out of the Air Force 6 years later, I still hadn't signed up for the draft, and so it was I got threatening letters like you do from the IRS saying that I better get down and sign up.
The World War II was a popular war from the standpoint of everybody getting involved because we had been attacked, and I was in college at the time, so I quit and I enlisted in the Air Force, and that was in 1943.
Pearl Harbor was December 7th, and I went to Portland January 31st, and it took them 4 months to get me signed up. I think I was about 23.
I was 22 years old, senior in college, my 5th year in college when the war broke out. And of course I was drafted into the infantry and applied for aviation cadets and went through my flying training and started out instructing in the old AT-6 at Luke Field, Arizona. They wanted volunteers to fly the B-17, and of course I thought that's great.
Along with the flight training, you had ground school where you would study additional courses in navigation, weather patterns, that sort of thing, and night flying where you were taking off and landing and flying around at nighttime.
The original turrets that we trained in was like the top of a bullet, it would be best to describe it. It was just a round dome with a flat bottom, and the whole thing turned back and forth, and it turned with a couple of handles that you had here, and as you turned the handles, it rotated.
Because we were needed overseas for D-Day, the invasion of France, they wanted all the pilots they could get over there and flight crews, so they shortened our training from 144 hours down to the 125 hours, and we were on our way overseas to England.
The difference between a B-24 and a B-17, and the trade-offs really, were that a B-17 had a very big, broad wing, and you could just knock great big holes in the thing and it would still fly. The 24 could fly higher and faster than a 17. In fact, we would go to on a bomb run. We would leave hours after they left, the 17s, meet them at the bomb run, drop our bombs, and be home and in bed before they got back. But they were in a plane which was basically a safer airplane. The Davis wing on the B-24 was such that it didn't take very much of a hit to destroy a Davis wing because they were so small and thin. And in that case, you had it.
Well, a B-24 was an ominous, big, ugly beast that you had to think way ahead. And as 20 years old, I didn't think that far ahead of a plane. And actually, the 17 flew a lot easier. But the big thing I liked about a 17 was that we were assigned to higher altitudes than the B-24s were. And at one time, that meant flying at 25,000 instead of 20,000, and just the difference made quite a difference in accuracy of the flak batteries.
B-17 was such a stable airplane. You look at it, it looks like an airplane. And it would fly on 3 engines forever. I've had 2 engines out on a B-17, and it flew okay. It's a pilot's airplane, everybody called it. And the rest of the crew loved it too. Not only the pilots, but your navigators and your bombardiers and so forth. They thought the B-17 was great.
By the time you plugged in your radio, which was a throat mic, your heated suit, your oxygen, and all those things, it was like being in a hospital bed with all these tubes running in. And that gave you a feeling of claustrophobia. Plus the fact you knew that if you had to get out quick, all that stuff had to be unplugged.
There was 12 of us. The pilot, co-pilots, navigator, bombardier, our first engineer, second engineer, a nose gunner, 2 waist gunners and tail gunner, and radio operator and radar operator.
Crew is a highly functioning body, and you don't know any of these guys, and you don't know whether they're good or bad, whether they know how to shoot a 50 caliber machine gun or not. And so it takes a few flights before you get any kind of trust in any of the other people. But it's a little bit like rock climbing. You get to the point where you have to trust the other people in order to live.
Another great thing about the B-17 was it had more gun power than the B-24. You had your tail gunner, top turret gunner, you had your chin gunner that was controlled just behind the cockpit, the ball turret and your upper turret, plus each side of the B-17. And the enemy, they respected that. A navigator, you have to know how to detect the wind drift, read the stars. Navigation was very critical. The radio man had very little to do, actually, on a combat run, because everything was pretty silent. They didn't want the enemy to pick up any radio signals, which was very easy in those days. They had to send code a lot, going into a target. The bombardier controlled the airplane by looking down through the bomb sight and setting the crosshairs so they were just exactly right. Into the cockpit, you had a space right behind the pilots where your engineer stood. The engineer was a very important man. He was continually looking out at the engines. If there was a little bit of smoke or the airplane was leaking oil, and he would report to the pilots, if your gear would not go down, which happened a lot of times, there's a special place for him to crank the gear down. The pilot did the takeoff, get into formation, and so naturally he needed some relief. As soon as he took over and got into formation, he'd say to the co-pilot, okay, you fly a while. So they took turns as far as flying is concerned. On takeoff and landing, the co-pilot had very definite jobs, putting up the gear, controlling the flaps, controlling the cowl flaps. The co-pilot was trained to do all of that so the pilot could concentrate strictly on flying the airplane.
I was an armor gunner, so I had schooling on all the guns on the B-24, 50 caliber, but also all the bombs, how to fuse the bombs and defuse them, all the turrets, how to maintain and operate all the turrets in case of a malfunction somewhere. I could repair them in flight. And same for all the guns. If it had a malfunction in the guns, I could get to them and repair them. South Pacific was warm, and all our missions were generally 10,000 feet or lower. But we were a night harassing squadron, and there was I think there was six ships, and we'd stagger every hour, just one ship up at a time. Commander of the base or whoever was ahead of all these missions would brief us on our target for that night, where the ships were, if there was a ship to find, and if we didn't have a ship, we always had a backup target, which was generally an airport someplace. Everybody was in the briefing, all crew members, and then we'd get in the truck and haul us out to the plane. We'd get in there, and the pilot would start up all the engine, warm it up, get it up to, each engine had to come up to a certain RPM before he'd take off. If the engine didn't meet the RPM, he wouldn't take off. We'd just scratch the mission. Because we had full bomb load and full gas load, and you had to have an engine working right to get that thing off the ground. And then we'd take off on our mission, and an hour before we got to the target, I'd fuse the bombs in the bomb bay, and then I'd go back to the tail position and stay in the tail position over the target. The bombardier had control of the plane at that time. And according to his bomb sight, when he had these target in his sights, well, he bombs away. And so if we didn't find a ship, we'd go over the backup target, which was generally an airport someplace. If we didn't drop our bombs, then I'd have to go back into the bomb bay and make them safe before we dumped them in the ocean, which wasn't too many times. Then we'd climb back to our assigned altitude and come on back to base. Most of our missions were 10 to 12 hours, right in there. We were in the Leyte at the time, and they had spotted a fleet of Japanese ships along the coast of China. And they didn't have enough, the B-25, they wanted to bomb it with B-25s for some reason or other, and they didn't have the gas range to reach the fleet and get back, to find the fleet and get back with the gas capacity they had. So they wanted the B-24 to go out and find the fleet and then radio a position back, and in the meantime the B-25s would be on their way. They'd just correct their course and get to the fleet. So they drew straws, and we were, of the 6 planes, 6 crews, we were the one that drew the long or the short straw, whatever it was, so we were the one that was picked to go find the fleet. And then when we found the fleet, we radioed the position, and the B-25s, I don't know how many there were in there. There must have been 50 or some, whole mess of them. They came right in on the fleet, and they just bombed the dickens out of it. And I saw several parachutes, so apparently one plane got hit at least. And we also had a submarine in the area to pick up anybody that got shot down. And then we turned around and we watched the fireworks for about an hour, flying up there, and watch it. And then we headed back after the bombing was all done. And we had quite a side wind, and we got blown off course. And at one point, the pilot was flying about 500 feet off the ground, off the ocean floor, I should say. And the co-pilot looked out the window, and we were in a bunch of clouds. You couldn't hardly see the wingtips, it was so thick. And anyhow, we burst out of that clouds all once, and the co-pilot looked over to his right, and there was a mountain sticking up there. We were below the top of the mountain. He said, "Hey, Griff, look at that mountain over there." Luckily, we weren't too far over that way. The pilot says, "You think that one's close? Look at the one on my side." There was another mountain on his side that was sticking up. We flew right between these two mountains, about 500 feet off the floor of the ocean. And just pure luck that we didn't hit one of them. And when that was during our mission coming back, and we were way off course, and the pilot says, "We're running out of gas." He says, "If we don't get land pretty soon, we're going to have to ditch the plane, or jump out, jettison the life rafts and bail out, or land on the ocean floor and ditch it that way." He put us up to us guys to take a vote. Everybody voted that we should better stay with the plane, ditch it. So he said, "Okay, that's the plan if we have to ditch. In the meantime, we'll keep flying." And about 5 or 10 minutes later, the radio operator hollered to the pilot, "Hey, I've got land, I've got land." The pilot said, "How far?" First thing he said was, "How far?" He's about 50 miles. pilot says, "I think we can make it." He says, "Where is it?" He says, "Clark Field, in Luzon, Clark Field." He said that they just captured the field, and there's Japs all around, small arms fire. And when you come in slow, come in fast and low and fast, and land it right away. Don't make any circle of the airfield like you normally do. You just come straight in and land it down fast because you're going to draw fire. So we came in real fast, laid it down, awful short runway. We made it. One engine died on the taxiing back to the hangar. That's how close we were to running out of gas.
We were given a new B-17 and had orders to fly to England. Over Raleigh, North Carolina, the plane caught on fire. I jumped a burning chute, landed in the tree. I sustained injuries. I was hospitalized for some 35 days. Replacements were brought up for the crew, and they went on overseas. When I got out of the hospital, I was then given top priority and was flown overseas. But when I did finally arrive at the base in England, that was my permanent assignment. In checking in, I asked for the crew that I had trained with and was told that they had been shot down the day before I arrived. I was assigned on a training mission with a crew that had 26 missions in already, and their regular co-pilot was not permitted to fly by the flight surgeon, and it was supposed to be a relatively easy flight, and that's why I was put on as co-pilot, and that's when I was shot down on my first mission.
They needed bodies over there. They were losing so many planes. And we were assigned to the 15th Air Force, and we were 2nd Bomb Group, 20th Bomb Squadron, in Amendola, Italy, which is in what they call the Foggia Plains, and we're right on the Adriatic.
We were prepared to fly to Gander Bay, and we flew south instead because they needed aircraft and replacement crews down there. It was just about the time in early '44 when we weren't winning the war. We were really losing it, and we were sacrificing an awful lot of air crews. And of course, we were getting the worst end of it, losing more people down in Italy. And so I ended in Africa, flew the B-24 over to Fortaleza and across to Dakar, and then it was destroyed in a ground accident that fortunately we weren't nearby. And yeah, we were all parked in a straight line, just like civilian aircraft always do, and a plane taking off sheared a tire and blew a tire and sheared the nose right off our plane. So it was totally destroyed, and fortunately for me, because from then on I flew B-17s. It was very primitive conditions. We lived in tents spread out around the field, and almost invariably you'd get up at 4 in the morning and it was miserable, and breakfast was greasy, usually cold eggs and coffee, and enough to make you sick to your stomach if you weren't already. And by the time we'd take off, we had already gone through intense briefing and had been assigned to our escape packages and all, and we had throttle and RPM settings assigned for the whole mission. The crews would already have been assigned what size bombs to load, and everything would be all loaded, and we'd wait for our turn. We're in radio silence, so we'd start taxiing out. They'd fire a flare without radio contact, and you'd all take off, and then you'd join up, and you'd do this by conserving fuel. You'd try to keep to a low setting so you wouldn't use too much fuel, and you'd join up by making big circles, and by the time you made the second circle, you should have had everybody joined up, and then you'd fly toward the target, and about there was a point where you'd turn off your IFF, which was a information friend or foe transmitter, and you'd usually try to time that so none of your own people would shoot at you. Then you'd join other groups all going north, and about the Udine area, we'd pick up maybe 150 enemy fighters, and they'd really clobber us, and then they'd refuel and be waiting for us on the way home. We'd fly over targets, like we'd fly over Wiener Neustadt and Ploesti and all, to give the Germans the idea that we were going to bomb that particular thing. And then we'd fly over our primary target, and that would confuse their air battle, and it would also keep everybody alerted so that the Messerschmitt plant couldn't work under a red alert, so they'd lose a few hours on that. And we tried in every way we could to be sure that we didn't bomb civilians, that we bombed only military targets. We bombed marshalling yards probably as much as we bombed anything else.
There were certain kinds of bombs sometimes that would hang up. The catwalk in those planes, because it was a V-shaped thing with a catwalk in the center about so wide, the tolerances of movement were so small that you couldn't wear a parachute. And so you'd have to get out on that catwalk and hold onto the spars and pry these things off with a screwdriver, but of course the bomb bay doors would be open. So you're looking down, straight down, and you're out on that little catwalk with a screwdriver prying these bombs off the hooks because they wouldn't drop by themselves.
We felt that strategic bombing, if we knocked out all the ball bearing factories in Germany, we certainly would. They were big SKF factories. We felt that the German aircraft production would go way down. And it did, I suppose, but Germans were sort of into a cottage industry where they could move the machines into somebody's house and go on making manufacturing. But we did cut into their efficiency to quite a bit. And whenever they would leave a field and they couldn't get a plane off, they'd run out and cut the tires off because they were so desperate for rubber.
Our main job was to support the invasion by making sure that the German Air Force was not in the air. And we did that by cutting off their oil supply. That was our job. By the time D-Day rolled around, they could hardly get an airplane in the air because they had no gasoline anymore. Their oil fields were all completely blanketed. What little gas they had went towards their tanks and that sort of thing. The Air Force was pretty much grounded at that point. The oil fields, of course, were very, very closely guarded with anti-aircraft. Some of the other places that we hit, like bridges and so on and so forth, there was no very little anti-aircraft around, and so there was really not much of a problem. But when you would go into briefing in the morning, which was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and they told you that you were going to hit Wiener Neustadt or Ploesti or Vienna or one of the oil fields, then everybody just gave a collective, oh, here we go again, because we knew that the flak was going to be terrific at those places.
The expression at that point in time was that you could get out and walk on the flak. There was so much of it. The Germans had a lot of 88 millimeter guns, and they were just blasting away. And a flak burst would be just a black burst, if you will, black smoke. Then they had some distance shots where they would explode and had different colors, but basically it was a black explosion. When you saw the flak, and if it was fairly close, you knew that almost instantaneously you were going to feel some noise. It was basically like someone throwing gravel at the plane when it didn't hit real solid objects.
Generally speaking, the fighter planes only accompanied you up to where you started the bomb run, which is where the flak really started to come up. They would then turn away, and then they'd meet you at the other end of the bomb run. The theory being that once you're on the bomb run, you're committed. You cannot maneuver the airplane. As a matter of fact, the pilot has no control in the airplane at that point. The Norden bomb sight is flying the airplane on a preset schedule, so that there's no way in the world you can veer off from flak or anything like that once you're on a bomb run. But the fighter planes, they didn't want to go through all that flak, and there was no reason for them to do it, really. It wasn't a matter of, being a hero or being a coward. There was no reason for them to do it. They weren't going to accomplish anything except get shot down anyway. The only fighter group that we ever had that accompanied us right through a bomb run were what we call the red tail, which was the Negro pilots, the black pilots. They would stay through with us all the way through. And when we saw their red tails, we knew that we had real friends out there, because these guys were not going to cut and run. In those days, they had their own elements. They didn't mix black and white pilots. There was a group of black pilots and a group of white pilots, and they never mixed. But the black pilots were more courageous, I would say, in staying with you. If you talk to anybody who flew when I did, and refer to either the red tail or the yellow tail outfits, you'll get the same reaction. Oh, those guys flew with us through hell. And that's, that isn't to demean anybody, because like I said, there was no reason for them to do it or not to do it. They just chose to do it.
So most of our missions were flying over the Alps. My first mission was the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, and that was a terrible target.
Well, the Ploesti raids were usually what they call maximum effort, where you would meet the 8th Air Force coming from England over the fields, because the idea was mass destruction. And we've had as many as 5,000 bombers in the air at one time, just kind of overlapping them and dropping bombs. But the key word was mass destroy everything. Nothing at all selective about those. And a lot of the smaller raids, you went with just maybe 3 elements of 7 planes or something of that sort.
Ploesti was, by the time we were hitting Ploesti, it seemed like there were groups ahead that were setting fires and bombing, and the Germans were using smudge pots to try to steer us away from the refineries. And so we'd fly into this mass of smoke and columns of smoke, and we tried to pinpoint the refinery, which was a little hard to do under all the weather. We had what they called a Mickey ship then. It was a radar operated, instead of a turret, we had a radar dome that would tell us where the steel railroad tracks were and where the rivers were, and it would pinpoint the target for us. The Germans, if they felt you have any advantage with a plane like that, they'd do head-on attacks, and at that time there were the pilots in Germany were the first ones were excellent, the next ones were eager, and it was quite often with a rate of closure of around 700 miles an hour. They coming at our nose, they quite often would hit the lead planes, and so we didn't want to lose our Mickey ship. We tried desperately to keep as many guns in a group as we could. So if you had one engine that wasn't really pulling enough inches of mercury, if you had a turbo that was not doing it at high altitude, you still tried to keep up with the group, and you still tried not to abort. I was happy that in 51 missions I didn't ever have to abort.
And that was my first mission. And I thought, my God, I have to do 50 of these? You know.
We had this terrible moment when you'd line up and your group would line up, and then if another group slid underneath you or above you, you circled and made another pass. One time we got frags dropped on our group, and by accident, because we weren't alert enough, and a couple of the planes had bombs sticking out of the wings when they came home. And that was tricky because they dropped through and exploded on the runway when we landed.
We had a belly gunner, the ball on the bottom, who was very, very small. Gosh, he couldn't have been more than about 5 feet tall and probably didn't weigh more than 100 pounds, which is why they picked him for a belly gunner. But being so small and so thin, they'd get big gaps in his oxygen mask, and so he would go out. You know, we'd count off about every 20 minutes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, from all positions. He'd get up to 9 and you'd hear nothing. Oh, God. Augie's got the mask off again. He was a German fellow from Pennsylvania. I forget his last name, but it was August something or other. Well, he could raise that turret, which had to come up about 4 feet, I guess, from a down position to an up position to get in it. He could raise that hydraulically, but from the inside, but you couldn't do it from the outside. It took 152 cranks on a crank to crank him up. Well, obviously, when Augie would go to sleep, he was not popular with the crew, because one of us had to get out, crank him up, jam the mask back on his face, cuss him out, and drop him back down again. And this must have happened 50 times. But it just so happened that he was so small that they couldn't make a mask small enough for him, and it would gap in the side. And then he was out like a light.
You almost always lost somebody in your crew, and one time flew with a squadron completely wiped out. Some of the fellows staggered back from other bases. They had landed somewhere else, but when I landed, I was the only plane that landed from our squadron. And next thing I knew, we went into town or up the coast the next day, and I came back, and here's a whole new group of planes. They had diverted planes that were going to other groups, and so we had replacements with all brand new Gs, which was the latest model, B-17. So, and they made the transition into shiny planes, and of course, us old pilots would take their new planes and give them our old war wearies.
There was a relief tube aboard, which brings up another little problem. The relief tube, unfortunately, the exit for the relief tube was right under my turret, which meant that it would follow the rear end of the plane right up and around and cover my window, and I'd end up with that much ice, which was urine, on my I couldn't see through it on my window. So I would plug up the relief tube and let them pee in the airplane. Anything else, you just kind of made sure it wasn't going to happen, because taking off that electric suit and being exposed to the air would be pretty uncomfortable. I never saw anybody do it.
See, there was every opportunity to not be there. If you wanted to stay in the States and be an instructor pilot, you could do it. If you wanted to go to combat, you could do it. Any morning that you got up and you said, I didn't get 8 hours sleep last night, I worried all night, they wouldn't send you up. But you wouldn't be a pilot any longer, probably. Nobody ever did it that I know of.
We were to bomb railroad bridges on the Seine River about 75 miles north of Paris. So that was the first mission. The Germans had moved some of their anti-aircraft guns in overnight and had set up a pretty good defense, which is what shot us down. We were getting hit all over the plane. but the final blow came right at bombs away, and the hit that sent us down was that a shell came into the oxygen bottles, which were positioned right behind the pilot and co-pilot, and the plane just burst into flames, the cockpit area. And that's when the crew started to bail out. The pilot rang the bell, which it was an emergency signal that you didn't ask questions when you heard that bell. You got the hell out of the plane.
We got to Slavison. The navigator says it's 10 minutes till the initial point. And so what we do at that time was we put on a flak vest to protect us from pieces of metal that's flying through the air, or bullets. And we put on a metal helmet. And so we did that, and we opened the bomb bay doors. When I was flying, I saw these white things pop out in front like that. And I thought it was mobile flak. They moved it around. I hit the mic to say, talk about it, and the tail gunner calls in and says, there's a million fighters coming in back here. And about that time, they were going by us. And in that first pass, they got our communication system. And they got the number one engine, and it started on fire. And they got our supercharger on number 2, which makes that engine practically useless.
Without the supercharger, you cannot fly to high altitude. The airplane just won't take it. All of the airplanes, World War II airplanes that did not have superchargers, had to stay down 10,000 feet or below.
So I'm looking at this lead plane, and he gets hit in the wing right at the fuselage, and there's just a ball of fire, and he goes straight down. And of course, the group, they're moving out, and so I push everything forward to try to keep up, but you know, it's useless. And it's not good for the engines anyway. But it's just automatic, that's what you do. And so we're flying, and pretty soon we're all alone, and there's one other plane flying, and we kind of move in together to kind of protect each other. But these fighters keep coming in and working us over, you know, 2 at a time. At 2 o'clock when the fighter plane comes in and he's fired, and I can see the guy's face, and I think, well, and then he goes like that and he misses us. I don't see how he missed us, but I thought we were dead.
The pilot and co-pilot were permitted not to wear their parachute pack. They could put it behind their seat, because when you're flying formation, throttle, stick, and everything, with that odd configuration that the parachute pack would have caused, it'd be almost impossible to fly it without getting extremely tired. Well, when the pilot left the pilot seat, and I grabbed him and I said, ring the bell, and so he sort of sat back down, rang the bell, but left so fast, and I'm trying to reach around my seat to get my parachute. And so I really didn't see what happened to him. I didn't know whether he went down the nose of the plane or went to the back of the plane. But I felt the plane starting to stall. And so my attention was diverted from getting my parachute pack to realizing that this thing is going to stall. So I sort of turned my body back towards the controls and pushed the stick forward to keep it from going, from stalling, and I dropped my parachute pack. And now we're in a dive, and my parachute tumbles into the nose of the plane, and it teeter-totters on the edge of that escape hatch.
In the meantime, we're so busy, we had to get that fire out. For one thing, it was getting into the wing. So we put the plane into a dive. And I think we were probably around 24,000, 25,000 feet. And we must have dropped 4,000 or 5,000 feet when we put it into a dive and feathered the engine and tried to blow it out, and leveled off, and it looked like it was out. So we started the engine again and it started burning again. And then they got another engine on the other side too, in the next deal. And at the same time, they shut all the controls out. Now the controls are cables that run through the plane, and they cut those so that your vertical stabilizer, which you run with your feet, and your horizontal ailerons with the wheel, were gone.
Centrifugal force in the dive was such that it held the parachute pack teeter-tottering on the edge of the escape hatch. But that same force kept me from being able to get down there and retrieve that pack. And my strength overcame the centrifugal force at the point in time where we must have started to slow down in the descent, where I was able to force movement down and get my hands on that pack and get it snapped on, and then just started to inch my way forward with my head out the escape hatch, working my way out through the escape hatch to where then the slipstream pulled me out. I was just so hyped up and so concerned with getting out of that plane that nothing else mattered. I didn't fear, I didn't stop and think about what I was doing. I did those things that, because of training or whatever, was instinct saying, get out any way you can, this thing is liable to blow up any minute.
Between Bill and I, there's a automatic pilot. We always had it on, so we just flipped the button and took over with that, because the automatic pilot has little electric wires that run out to motors on the wings and in the back. It's pretty hard to cut those. So we're flying this thing with these little knobs. And of course, there's not much flying to it anymore because we're the only plane there. I don't know what happened to the other one. But in the meantime, we thought, well, there's nobody around, maybe we can get out of here. And of course, we're going down slowly. And we know we couldn't get back to the Alps, and we couldn't get over them anyway. But we thought maybe we could get out of the area and get out quite a ways and maybe get in a little more friendly atmosphere, or crash land, or anyway. But two fighters stayed with us. They wouldn't let us go. And they would come shooting in, and Sergeant Payne was killed. He got hit with a 20 millimeter in the back. And the tail gunner was wounded. And he got wounded in his wrist, and he had to go up to the radio operator for first aid. And while they're in the radio room, they both get flak in their legs and get wounded again. And then the ball turret, his gun was all jammed, and he came up, and of course Payne had fallen right over the ball, and that didn't help him either, so they were trying to take care of Payne. And then there was a chute, Payne's chute was all shot up, so Griffin went clear back into the tail and got an extra chute and brought it out for him. And I think he got a special medal for that, Silver Star or something, because that plane could blow any minute. Sergeant Hyatt, he was flying as gunner and as bombardier that day. He dropped the bombs, and one of them hung up. And the propeller on the bomb was going around. As I pulled the wires on it, we would have been blown to hell. The last blow came from the left side, where the where the pilot sits. They blew a big hole in the oxygen tanks. And the black smoke and everything came into the cockpit, and the plane just shuddered like this, you know. And so anyway, we said, now's the time, we got to get out. I told Bill, let's get the hell out of here. We all went out to Bombay. And people have asked me, well, were you scared? Well, I don't think we were scared. We didn't have time to be scared. We were too busy. You get a big whoosh, and you're just tumbling. And it's kind of like swimming. You straighten out and stop this thing, and pretty soon you're falling, and everything's serene and quiet. You feel after the battle, it's kind of nice.
I jumped at probably 25,000 feet and delayed opening the chute until I was down to about 2,500 feet, which was a little bit too high. We were told that the best thing to do would be to delay the opening of your chute, both to get out of the oxygen free altitude and the freezing and cold, and to get down closer to the ground, which also would hopefully prevent the Germans from shooting at you coming down in the chute. And when the chute did open, that's when the Germans were shooting at me coming down in the parachute. I was able to slip and rock the chute, so they physically didn't connect with me, but they did hit the silk. And as they punched holes in the silk with their bullets, you would fall a little faster. You would accelerate because the canopy had an additional escape hole for the air to rush through. So when I did hit the ground, then I thought surely I'd be looking at a bunch of rifle barrels by German soldiers, and when I hit the ground, I just started to run as fast and hard as I could.
At about 3,500 feet, I thought I should pull the chute, see if it'll work. If it doesn't, there's 3 cutter keys here. I can pull them out and get it out. So when it opens, your feet go up and your head go up, and you think, oh, God, am I going to be okay, you know? So I'm swinging like this, and so I kind of straighten it out. And by that time, I'm practically down on the ground. I look down, and there's some high-tension wires. And I could see all these people running. And I was, so I grabbed this thing to miss the wires, and I went over them like that, and about the last 100 feet, it just kind of collapsed, and my butt hit the ground hard, and it kind of knocked the wind out of me, and that was about all there was to it. When I got down, Lieutenant Novak was already there. They were kind of friendly to us. But then the Gestapo came.
When I hit the ground, I started to run for the nearest cover, which was a hedgerow. And since the Germans had shot at me with ground fire, I expected the Germans to be waiting for me when I got out of the parachute. And when they weren't there and I started to run for the nearest cover, there were 2 French civilians that were standing there, and I was running right towards them because they were standing where the nearest hiding place would be, which was the hedgerow. And they motioned for me to run the other way. They motioned like that, and you don't know who to trust or whatever, so I just veered over and ran towards the hedgerow, but at an angle. And as it was, 2 Germans were coming to pick me up. If I would have run right into them had I continued on the course that I started on.
So they took us into the city where the raid was on, which is a bad thing to happen to you. The closer you got to the city, there'd be a bomb crater someplace, and the guards would get a little ornerier. Anyway, they took us into the city, into a real beautiful building. It was a white marble like. We took in about a city block. And it was a low profile. It was a beautiful building. Anyway, they took us in there, and I think we were on the 2nd floor. And of course, they stood us up against a wall. Then they took us one at a time across the hall there to a small room. And there was a major in there and some guards and a secretary. And they had us stripped down and checked us over for everything. When we practically had nothing on, they were still looking you over. And they took our dog tags, and all they wanted to know is where we were born, which was no great secret. We were across the hall, and I'm on the right end, and they take this major would come along, and he'd grab these young guys and slap them and call them all kinds of names, you know, and he went to do that to me, and I threw my arms up and stopped him. And about that time, my arms went down, and about three of these big guards, they knocked me down. And they'd beat me, and then they'd help me back up, and I'd shake my head, and then they'd do it all over again. And about the third time, I saw this old man, well, he's in his 50s or 60s, in a dark suit, pretty husky guy. He come over and went like this. And so they kind of stood back, and I thought, boy, he's going to stop this fight. So I'm standing there, and he hauls off and hits me right between the eyes. And I used to have a bump on my nose. He straightened my nose out and broke it good, and then the blood was flying, and they threw me back up against the wall. Anyway, pretty soon a stenographer came out of one of those rooms and took me around the corner, and there was a wash tub there, and she let me try and stop the bleeding. And we got in the bus again, and we went to an old jail on the outskirts of town.
Anyway, so I ran down the hedgerow, and as I turned around the far end of the hedgerow, a young Frenchman just stepped right in and ran with me. I couldn't speak French, he couldn't speak English, but we just fell in step. It was harvest time, it was August, and the fields had shocks of wheat, which were the shocks being composed of small bundles of wheat that had been cut, tied, and I ran into the middle of the field, spread some of the bundles apart, got down in the shock of wheat, and this young Frenchman that ran with me just tucked the bundles back around me and left. This was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. My face was pretty well burned, and the wheat was cutting into my face, the wounds, and needless to say, it was very painful, but I was afraid to move because I felt that if I moved at all, I would knock over one of the bundles that had been tucked around me, and I also could hear the stubble, wheat stubble from the cut grain on the boots of the Germans who were looking for me.
We stayed in there, and by this time, you know, we got up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and now it's about 10 o'clock at night. So you lay down, you fall asleep, and you dream a little, and you wonder, could this really happen to me today? You know, and the guards start getting up and getting their rifles, and we thought we were going to be shot because they took our dog tags, so there's no evidence. I talked to myself and says, now how are you going to take this, you know? Anyway, the phone rang, and this captain's on the phone quite a while. When he gets through, they take us back to our cell. And later on that morning, I don't know, around 10 o'clock, they turn us over to the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe takes us down and puts us on a train. And I sat down to this guy, and he's got a nice jacket on. He looks well fed, and he's got a sack. And it was Colonel Gabreski. He introduced himself. And he gave me one of these rolls. And he's one of the aces in the war. And he finally, at the end, became our commanding officer of the compound I was in. From there we went to Stalag Luft 1, which was up on the Baltic. And we were out on a peninsula just south of Sweden and straight north of Berlin.
At 5 o'clock that night, three men on bicycles came out, put me on the middle bicycle, gave me a change of clothing, and we rode into this little town of San Cyr. We went into the main part of town, turned down this side street, and that's where they hid me out. For the first 4 days, I was in hiding up in an attic in a house. And on the second night, they told me that the Germans had the first two houses on this street. Well, that had me a little bit concerned. But they had a couple of the crew members at another house who were in the French underground. Well, at the end of 4 days, then we got up in the morning, I guess it was about 2 o'clock, and we walked out to the edge of this little town, two members of the underground, and took me to where the two enlisted men were. So they let me stay there with the two enlisted men, and that's where we were at the end of the time when we were liberated. We saw a German general that morning at about 10:30. That afternoon at 1:30, we were free, liberated. And needless to say, it was a joyous occasion, obviously, and the townspeople all turned out to see us and greet us and give us all their famous kisses and so forth on each cheek, and we were liberated.
Our job was to survive, and we did.
I was in Tampa, Florida, ready to be shipped to Kansas to train in B-24 or B-29s in order to support the invasion of Japan. And we were a pretty unhappy lot, knowing that we were going to have to go through this all over again. And boy, when they dropped that bomb, let me tell you, you can give all the I can't think of the word I want, but all the arguments that you want to give as to whether or not we should have. But to those of us who were training to go over to the Pacific, it was there was nobody who complained about it. Today, I take a little different view. I think it could have been handled politically without the loss of life. But at that time, boy, I was as happy as could be, because it meant I didn't have to go.
There were 12,731 B-17s built, and there are only about 10 or 12 that are in flight condition now. And when you stop and think, they built that many. Granted, we lost a lot of them in the war over Europe, but these are the only ones that remain from all those thousands and thousands of planes that were built. All the others were destroyed, so I feel, tremendous.
I spent 6 years in the Air Force and went from a private, and I really felt that I learned an awful lot in those 6 years.
The instructors didn't get too much publicity and this and that, and naturally the combat people were the ones that deserved it. But they had to have the instructors. And I think a lot of your combat people say, well, it's a good thing I had a good instructor.
I learned a lot in the service. The service is a good teacher. I mean, it teaches you a lot.
I don't have very many happy memories. It was pretty serious business all the way through.
It was great to get home.
Coming in on a wing and a prayer. So there's one can still carry on, coming in on a wing and a prayer. What a show, what a fight. Yes, we really hit our target for tonight.